Welcome back, retro gaming fans. We are going back to Blood Bowl today. As you probably have guessed by now, Blood Bowl is my favorite Games Workshop game of all time. And today we are going to be painting probably what I would consider the most important team to have when you're starting up a league. So it's a bit of a weird one, but Blood Bowl has games on multiple dimensions, right? Like, first of all, there's the whole tactical level of how you actually win your game, how you actually, hike that ball down the pitch and try to score a touchdown. But on the flip side, there is also the importance of the health of the ecosystem. And when it comes to ecosystem health and maintaining, a playable field against the more egregious, like agility-based teams of the Warhammer world, you've essentially got the dwarves, who are the closest thing to an ecosystem policeman by sorting out all sorts of like sneaky, dodgy gutter runners like skinks and all the kinds of small, annoying players that just make a chaos player's life a bit of a nightmare. Dwarves are incredibly well equipped out of the gate for what they cost. They bring an incredibly good skill set to the pitch, and I would argue they are important for the health of any league because they actively keep agility based teams in check. To put it in context, if you had a league comprising entirely of agility based teams, so for example, you had Skaven, you had Wood Elves, you've got High Elves, and all that sort of thing, all together, they would run away with the scoring of the league. Like, there is almost no chance that anyone else has a chance to break into that kind of scoring system. If you're Chaos, for example, and you're really lacking players with any kind of skill, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Dwarves are kind of the league policemen, and they stop agility based teams from running away with the scoring, so to speak. So, anyway, back to the miniature for now. We are going to be doing this in the classic Dwarf Giants color scheme. Giants should tip you off immediately to which real life NFL team the Dwarves were essentially modeled after in terms of their colors and strip. Clearly, the New York Giants are a thing, and I think that the designers knew exactly what they were trying to do. But I suppose the one concession they made to trying to be a little bit unique and special was to add lots of yellow to the color scheme to kind of disguise things a little bit. I'm not aware whether earlier New York Giants strip had like yellow in it. I kind of seem to recall that they do. Also, a lot more white as far as I understand. But there you go. So, yellow areas are being done in Iyanden yellow, or they have been done in Iyanden yellow. That's on the shoulder pads, and that's going to be a good base for us to work on over this Pylox gray white undercoat, which is just a standard undercoat that I like to use a lot. It does me a lot of, I basically, that's my go-to color for all of the undercoats because it makes, as I have mentioned many times in the past, the contrast paints a lot less overly vibrant and actinic looking. So this really helps a lot to kind of make it look a little bit more sensible. So the blue is the signature color of the Dwarf Giants, in my opinion, and really needs to be front and center. But painting a dwarf team always poses the same challenge, which is how on earth are you going to make sure that giant beard on the front of the model kind of doesn't take over the color scheme entirely because it's going to be so large and so impactful and bright. If you were to choose a relatively bright color, it would essentially drown out the color of the strip that the dwarf is wearing. So, with that in mind, I tend to favor, I guess, more muted colors for dwarves. I mean, honestly, it might just be that I'm the only person on earth who has this problem, but I kind of like the team strip of a team to be front and center, while all of the regular colors I try to keep a little bit more muted. Simply because I want to be able to distinguish my teams at a glance. I don't necessarily want to look at a dwarf team and immediately see nothing but beards, which is, what tends to happen if you stick with very bright or very warm and inviting colors for your beards, which is actually what I guess most people would do if they were painting, say, a Warhammer army. It's always a good idea to vary up those beards because so much of a dwarf's person is covered in beard. I try to keep them as small as possible so that we get maximum amounts of team color on your dwarfs. So the dwarf color scheme is actually fairly straightforward. He's essentially got uh, blue gloves, blue helmet, and blue sort of undershirt, and he's got white pants, and he's got yellow shoulder pads. So quite interesting that one of these little studs, these little like tokens on his forearm, probably fell off during casting because it seems to be missing from this miniature. But yeah, that's a thing that happens with a lot of older miniatures. Sometimes these things don't stay on the surface forever. But there you go. Cool. So that's it for the blue. There is actually a very small amount of flesh on his arms. Let's probably do that in flesh tones because I think that makes the model looks a lot more recognizable as a dwarf. And everything from his shirt to the waist down, all of that is probably going to be white because that was the color of the strip for that team that is kind of not the basis for Dwarf Giants in any way, shape, or form. That would be illegal. Absolutely not. So yeah, I'm gonna do the shirt in blue as well because unless I'm mistaken, I believe the original strip had blue upper bodies. But you know what? So long as we keep it broadly within that category, and more importantly, keeping to the original color schemes that are found in White Dwarf, I think we're going to have something that's going to be quite recognizable and quite attractive to look at. Beards are either going to be black or white, just because they are neutral and desaturated, or maybe gray, I suppose. And I don't want them to overtake the color scheme. So this particular dwarf is going to have a black beard, if only to just sort of make sure that you can recognize the dwarf for what he is. Sorry about that. Let me just kill that off. Cool. Yeah, so that looks good in my opinion. I'm going to grab a little bit of silver gray to do a bit of touch-ups around where I got a bit of blue onto his shoulder pad. Just a quick one. That's over here. Sometimes that happens. We just touch these up and we move on. Mistakes happen. Get on this flesh. And that's going to be ready for us to put on a little bit of Guilliman Flesh plus Seraphim Sepia, which is our usual flesh tone mix. Because I think a small amount of flesh, if you can find it on a dwarf, really sort of grounds the miniature and reminds us that this is actually a living thing under all of this incredible armor. So I'm going to jump in and add a lot of silver now to wherever we have anything that's metal or potentially gold. I haven't decided on gold because I think the gold will interfere with all of the yellow on the miniature, which, unlike the gold, it's actually going to be part of the color scheme. So yeah, probably I think I would defer to just leaving them silver. It makes them seem more armored and tough and hard anyway. Plus, looking well equipped, which is what every dwarf team should be. Dwarf teams don't lose players, unlike others, because your average dwarf is about as unkillable as they get. Therefore, you probably want to make sure that your team is healthy and growing all the time by adding new miniatures, so each one of these guys can be as hard and as tough as you like. Yeah, so back to the idea of meta in the Bloodbowl League. Dwarves are really important for the health of your meta because although nobody who plays an agility team wants to play against a dwarf team, you kind of want every other agility-based team that you're up against playing with a dwarf team, because there are very few agility-based teams that will come out of a scuffle with a dwarf team without losing at least a couple of key models. Dwarves are extremely good at punishing models which rely on dodge or high movement rate to get away from them. And the reason why they have this ability is because their basic player, which is this 70,000 gold piece Longbeard that I'm painting right now, come out of the gate with block and tackle. That means if you're trying to dodge away from these guys, tackle means that you can't use your dodge skill to get out of the defender stumbles result. So that's not going to be protecting your life. And if you happen to roll both down, they can also floor you quite easily. A lot of agility based teams are very, very short on block skill. So for 70k, a dwarf lineman, which is called a longbeard, is an absolutely brutal unit that comes out perfectly out of the gate, perfectly equipped to deal with the fast players of your opponents. The downside is that they're not the fastest models available to a dwarf team, but you know what? The ability to continually floor your opponent's most valuable pieces is more than worth it, more than makes up for this, in my opinion. No reason to not take a good number, a healthy lineup of linemen longbeards just to fill up your roster when you play Blood Bowl. And you will start to reap a dividend of agility player corpses over time, so long as you continually move them into base contact with all of the dodge players out there. You'll find that, generally speaking, dodge players spend a lot of effort trying to get themselves away from your dwarf team longbeards, and for really good reason, because these guys really are killers. Kind of wonderful if you're the dwarf team, less great if you are the team on the receiving end. But trust me, everybody else who plays an agility team will be watching the game with glee, hoping that the dwarves break as many fingers from gutter runners as they can, because that's just how the meta works. And while that may sound a little bit cruel, a league that is dwarfless is going to be just miserable, because the agility teams who are already well placed to score easily are simply going to run away with it. There is no happier sight for a chaos team than a dwarf team breaking the fingers of every single gutter runner or war dancer they can get their hands on, simply because that's every one of these players that gets killed by a dwarf longbeard is simply one that the chaos team doesn't have to deal with. And that's a really happy place to be as a long time chaos player myself. So on the flip side, however, you don't want too many dwarf teams, because I think one of the biggest problems with the dwarf team, although they are a really effective team, really good lineup, is that they have a tendency to not progress much. It's hard to score as a dwarf team. Most of the time, dwarf teams will take the entire half, if not both halves, to get a decent scoreline. And what that simply means is that most games that they win are going to be just 1-0. And when it's 1-0, frankly, that's not enough star player points for the dwarves to really level up. Granted, they tend to hold on to their star player points because it's really hard to kill these like little short monsters, but the flip side is that they don't raise level very, very fast. The other major problem with dwarves, in my opinion, and this is the big one, is that they are a relatively boring team to level up, because frankly, with block, tackle, thick skull on all of their linemen, and the availability of really quite effective blitzers as well as runners, the dwarves are a solved team right out of the gate. There's nothing really too exciting, in my opinion, about leveling these guys up. And leveling a team is one of the most exciting things that you can do, because it basically gives dwarf teams, or gives teams in general, the ability to pick up key skills and to unlock new strategies. The dwarves never unlock anything new, in my opinion, other than to invest in a death roller for funsies at some point. That is a little unfortunate, because, in my opinion, dwarf teams kind of lose out on that progression game, and that makes it a little bit boring for the dwarf players. So while they fulfill a vital role in keeping their ecosystem healthy, policing all the agility teams to stop them from block dodging their way through the game, it's a little unfortunate that the dwarves themselves don't tend to do very well. But they also tend to end up fairly close to the top because once they pick up a few guard players, and everybody, including the runners, has block, the team just settles into a very low scoring meta, um, winning 1-0 most of the time. That's not the most exciting outcome. And frankly, all dwarf teams develop the same way because there is no reason to not take guard or mighty blow on your longbeards, turning them into even tougher and harder players to deal with. So that's unfortunate. Vital to have around, but yeah, the dwarf team, out of all the teams that are in Blood Bowl right now, in my opinion, I would love to see overhauled because they kind of had the same problem as the old Amazon team. They're solved out of the gate. There's nothing really creative you can do with a dwarf team. It's effective, sure, but it's going to be doing the same thing every single time you bring it to the pitch. And that's a bit unfortunate because, we put a lot of investment and a lot of painting and a lot of effort into making these guys look cool and have cool backstories. By the way, I'm highlighting the yellow with Phalanx yellow in case you were wondering. Yeah, we put a lot of effort into making these models, come alive on the tabletop. It kind of sucks a little that you generally have dwarf players only want to play their team once before they get bored of it and they sort of understand what a dwarf team brings to the table, and then they go on to another team entirely because, well, those ones have a lot more player expression in them. And then, of course, you reach the point where, unfortunately, there are not enough dwarf teams on the pitch to keep agility teams in check, and then that micro meta starts to fail. And again, you get agility teams running over the place. So it's a bit of an unfortunate meta issue with the way Blood Bowl works right now. But then again, the Dwarfs are a really old legacy team, and they've more or less remained unchanged since the very early editions of Blood Bowl. And I don't see them changing anytime soon, unfortunately. Although I do dearly hope that something is done to sort of rein in the one-dimensionality of the dwarf team. I don't mind that they are effective against agility teams. I'm just a little bit bothered by the fact that the team doesn't offer dwarf players a lot to do, unless they're just out to break legs. And yeah, in that sense, they are really good at it, but it's kind of a negative player experience all the way around if that's all they're trying to do. Anyway, so I think he's looking pretty decent. I put on the silver, I put on the first Phalanx yellow highlight onto the yellow, and I've put on Talassar Blue, which I haven't mentioned yet, unfortunately, for his jersey. That's right. I'm just wondering. The gloves are interesting. There's a lot of detail on them, but it's not entirely clear immediately which bits are which. There we go. So this is silver as well. Essentially, where there are these sort of round rondelles, those really ought to be silver, and everything else should be blue. So yeah, this is more correctly blue, and then the ends of the fingers more correctly silver. So I'll need to fix that in a little bit. Yeah. Not to worry, every dwarf longbeard that you buy is going to have a really long career on the pitch, at least up until the point that you get bored playing dwarves, which unfortunately tends to come sooner than anticipated. Just on the pitch, playing dwarves, playing dwarves is a bit of a patience game. They don't have a very exciting play style. A lot of what they need to do is getting their long beards up against the sort of scoring elements of other teams. So, for example, trying to get into base contact with things like gutter runners, getting into base contact with things like ghouls and such, because they turn off the dodge skill for all of these kinds of players. And there's nothing more satisfying than watching a gutter runner roll a 1 to fall flat on his face while trying to dodge away from a dwarf longbeard. Unfortunately, when the dwarves have possession, it tends to bog down into a relatively slow and time-consuming game to try to get them to score. But that's just how dwarves are. It's kind of fun to watch the Skaven sort of break their faces against your armor, trying to get the ball away from your scoring elements. So there is that, I guess, to look forward to. It's just that the games, in my opinion, tend to come out a little bit samey and repetitive, but that's just how it is, I suppose. I mean, the alternative is far, far worse, which is to not have any dwarves on the pitch, which is terrible, really, for your meta. So that's not going to happen. For the horns, I'm going to go straight in with some Skeleton Horde, undiluted full strength, because I think naturalistic colors like this add a bit of warmth to a scheme that's going to be largely just silver and blue. I've decided to forego all gold, which is a rare thing, I know. My gold mix is very near and dear to my heart, but I'm not going to use any of it on this miniature because I want the yellow on the shoulder pads to kind of be the only source of that highly saturated warmth. So I'm going to let it stand out by holding back on the gold. From afar, gold and yellow tend to look very similar, so having both of them present in large amounts makes the yellow a lot less eye-catching. So yeah, what this will mean is that I need to do all of the ancestor symbolism, the ancestor sort of bits of detail. I'm going to leave all of that in essentially silver, which is a bit of heresy, but it's okay. I think they will look good nonetheless. It's a tiny amount of nose just nestling under this face helm. I do like the very Nordic sort of look of this design. If you sort of look past the fact that he's got essentially giant, like, faux Viking horns. I know Vikings in real life don't have horns, didn't have horns, but it is what it is because these are dwarfs. These are not Vikings, they are dwarfs. And they have no idea what a Viking is. What's a Viking? So, yeah. Cool. Now, it's time to jump in with, I think, Nuln Oil, just to darken. Maybe we should do the beard first. Let's do the beard first. So the beard, as I mentioned, is going to be black because I don't want it to detract from the color of the uniform. And I think this will make you realize just how dangerous it is to apply a light colored beard color on these miniatures, because you can sort of see how much real estate on the front of the miniature is really taken up by beard, front and back, because the beards go all the way around to the back. Look at that. It's kind of insane, really, when you think about it. Well, they are long beards for a reason, and I really do like the fact that they've made some concession towards the needs to move by tying the beard all the way around the back. They're not willing to compromise by trimming their beard. That would be heresy. But what they do is they just sort of tie it around their waist, and this is maybe one of the reasons. Maybe this is just headcanon for me, but maybe this is one of the reasons why dwarves are quite so tough. Because in addition to all that padded jerkin and chainmail that they are wearing, they've got this thick band of beard that kind of goes everywhere, and I imagine dwarf hair is just as tough as anything else dwarf related. Don't think dwarf hair is all of that fine or lustrous. It's probably just as tough as the dwarves themselves. So yeah, so much beard and so cool as a result. This goes all the way over here on the right side as well, and it really goes right up to where his helmet is, leaving just that tiny little bit of nose under the helmet showing. So I think this looks pretty good. I believe Games Workshop used this color scheme later for the Norse team, only because I think it kind of has that kind of Scandinavian sort of vibe. Well, when I say Scandinavian, what I mean is that it basically makes a team look like a walking IKEA showroom. So yeah, make of that what you will, but I don't believe it's a poor choice of colors at all. It does get the vibe across. But it looks particularly good on these dwarves as well, which is why I went for it. Also, you can't really paint a dwarf team without doing the dwarf giants, right? They're kind of iconic. They are kind of like the most significant dwarf team in, you know, old and new lore. I believe the current dwarf team, which was released with the 2016 version of Blood Bowl, is also a dwarf giants team, except they've taken out the yellow, which is heresy in my opinion. But you know, that's just how it is. Grumpy old man thoughts. Yeah. Cool. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. I also want to drop a little bit more Guilliman flesh into his eyes, because his eyelid over there is flesh toned, such that it is. There is very little of it, so we should make the most of any opportunity to try to put as much of it in to the miniature as possible. So you can sort of see that once you do the beard in black, it kind of takes it out of the equation as far as dominating the color scheme goes. Were I to have done it in like maybe blonde, or like as in the box art, which had it in orange, because yes, I know the Slayers are going to be a bit of a problem for this color scheme. Except I don't really mind that the Slayers are nice and different and standing out beautifully. Yeah, so I think overall I'm happy with this choice of color. Gonna grab a bit of Vallejo Silver Grey and start to put some striations on the horns, which were previously painted in Skeleton Horde. Just a little bit of this, not too much, and just adding that little bit of additional personality for the horns to make them look less just basic and boring. And then we might come in with another coat of Skeleton Horde, because oddly enough, the detail on the edge of these horns isn't the deepest. That transition with the end caps could be a lot tighter in my opinion, but it doesn't look bad one way or other. Cool. There we go. So you're probably wondering what his pants, his sort of skirt, as well as all of the armor is going to be, and all of that is going to be Nuln Oil, because like I mentioned, these guys are based on a real life team, and the strip for that team at the time that this was produced, this team was designed back in the day. You have to remember that Blood Bowl was written in 1988, so they would have been designed based on that era's teams. And the Dwarf Giants, the New York Giants, were really important at that time. So yeah, dropping in a whole bunch of Nuln Oil over all of the silver bits, all of the chainmail, all of these medallions, these knuckle duster pieces, as well as all of the white areas, the sort of off-white color that I chose for the legs. All of this should be white, because the New York Giants did in fact often wear white pants. I'm sure the true American football fans among you will be able to correct me on this, or to sort of fill me in on which year this strip belongs to. But it's pretty iconic looking, and I really like the way they've translated this onto a fantasy miniature like a dwarf. It really adds to the sort of personality and humor of the Blood Bowl game. Good stuff. So this goes all the way around. Even his boots are white, simply because they would have been wearing cleats, and the leather bits of the cleats, I believe, for the New York Giants were white. And it's a really unusual kind of look to have on a miniature, but Blood Bowl is an unusual game, so that kind of works. So putting that on to his horns as well. And this goes all the way around. There is a surprising amount of Nuln Oil on the miniature. It's okay if it gets onto the blue, because the blue is way stronger as a color anyway. It's less okay if it gets onto the yellow, So we want to be a little bit careful about making sure that the yellow stays nice and clean, because that's the sort of standout part of the color scheme. And then these horn areas, which not authentic New York Giants strip color, unfortunately, but sometimes having some horns goes a long way to making sure that people don't quite blitz you with their full strength, maybe giving you the upper hand as a result, as well as being an actual dwarf. So one thing I really do like about the dwarf team in Blood Bowl is that they wanted to make a bruiser sort of team, um, but the orcs have, in my opinion, the orcs have the monopoly on the good stats. So what they've done is they've essentially made a team that's skillful rather than strong, and the dwarves are incredibly effective at the style of play that they have, and look really great doing it as well. Okay, so just this last bit of silver, and then I'm going to hit the hair dryer in a bit. Okay. Okay, we are back, and so now what we want to do is take a little bit of ice yellow, and we're going to start adding a little bit more detail to the yellow sections. In reality, you're probably going to want to leave these areas for numbers, because dwarves are likely to have a much cleaner and neater way of approaching their numerals. I suggest you use transfers for this, as I most certainly will, because I think for the orcs, you might be able to get away with a sort of crudely painted on thing, but for dwarves, I think that might be a little bit less attractive. So ice yellow, pure ice yellow, now going on to the very apex points of the armor plate. And I think this should be looking pretty good. So now that all of the Nuln Oil has dried on our undercoat sections, now we should have a fairly good base to do our white. So this was originally Pylox Grey White, as you know, my standard undercoat color, and then now there is a layer of Nuln Oil giving it a little bit of color, a little bit of gray, basically, if you could call that color. And then now we're going to come in and just apply some quick highlights over that previous layer of sort of warmish gray, which is what Nuln Oil creates when you apply it over the Pylox Grey White, or Vallejo, otherwise known as, well, roughly equivalent to Vallejo Silver Grey for me, both of which are colors I really enjoy because they're light colored enough for contrast paint to show through, but not too light to the point where it makes the contrast paint really look fluorescent and artificial looking, in my opinion. So lots of areas where these sections can be picked up. So it's just a case of going through them and making sure that you hit all of these areas with the white. His toe caps are silver. I realized I missed that out previously, so I filled that in after I was doing, while I was doing the hair drying. So apologies that you didn't actually see me paint those in silver, but it's just painting in silver. I don't think there's anything important that you missed. And then just a little bit more white where needed. With applying white highlights, I always find that it's best to sort of build it up gradually, because white is almost always titanium dioxide, which is an incredibly chunky pigment. So it does benefit from being built up in layers. It's very likely that the first time you paint white, you're not going to get a nice smooth, like creamy surface. You're probably going to get some streaking and some brush marks. So in my opinion, being patient and coming in for a second go really improves the look of the miniature. And it's just one of those things to remember when trying to apply this sometimes very tricky color in a strength that you can see on the miniature. So I think the one area where I think this model needs a little bit more clarity is on his belt. So I am going to block in his belt again in essentially Vallejo Silver Gray. Put that over here. And I'm going to come in with probably, I don't know, maybe Goregrunta Fur. Just a nice neutral color. Maybe add a bit of warmth to that area. And over on his back as well, because I think you do need to respect the material um, of the belt. It should be in a leather-like color and not just a generic sort of white, because even though the belt doesn't feature prominently on the actual New York Giants strip, I think this is a fantasy universe, and so it does help to respect the materials that these things are supposed to be crafted from in real life, respect the world building in that sense. Okay, so a little bit more white to pick out the final highlights on here, on his horns. It's probably a good idea to not overdo this, since we already had silver gray highlights before, but a little bit really goes a long way towards making the horn sections really come alive and add a little patch of warmth to the miniature, which, it must be said, barring the yellow, is looking very cold indeed, which is not a terrible thing. It just maybe needs a little bit more warmth and dynamism. Dynamism? Yeah, there we go. So I think that looks a lot better now. A little bit of white goes into the Talassar blue that we had previously, and we can start to apply some highlights. Right, so let's start with the apex of his helmet. Just make sure that the eye is drawn there when looking at the rear of the miniature, and sort of like feather it in a little bit with a bit of diluted paint, and the tiny amount of actual glove showing can be brought out, as well as the small sections of helmet, as well as his thumb and his palms and the other section of gauntlet. I really do feel like one of these icons probably popped off the miniature while they were making the original master molds, which is why there's a gap there. It's kind of strange and unfamiliar. Like, it looks like a mistake, but it's okay, it is what it is. And it's all part of the charm, really. I do like to celebrate the fact that these models are sculpted by hand, and I quite enjoy it when there are these little imperfections. Sometimes on the miniatures, it doesn't really bother me, rather it adds to the conversation that old school 1:1 type sculpting and a very manual mechanical process is really interesting and intrinsic to the way these earlier miniatures were designed, and not really something that we should be losing sleep over, in my opinion. So a little bit more of a lighter blue for the absolute apex, and I think that looks pretty good. Again, this is almost like a spot highlight now. You don't need a lot of it, you just need to put it where the eye is naturally drawn to, and it really goes a long way towards making the miniature pop. So all these little sections really should have a tiny amount of it, because it really helps them to stand out a little bit more. His thumb, for example, is a really important detail to help you understand that this is his hand. And for a model that's essentially such a distorted, like, human form, it's particularly important to make sure people know what they're looking at. So yeah, I think he's looking pretty good. I think the last thing I want to do is to grab a little bit of Nuln Oil and just kind of put them over. Should I do that? You know what? I changed my mind. I'm instead going to grab a bit of ice yellow and put them over these studs. So that really has more of the look of he has shoulder pads with studs, and then they kind of painted the whole thing one solid color, which is why the rivets are in the original yellow color, or rather the rivets are the painted yellow color rather than the original metal. So I think that looks pretty good. It's always a choice to decide whether you want to imply that the riveting was done after the model was the shoulder pad was painted or before. I think in this case, to imply that the painting of this shoulder pad by this dwarf was done after really makes it look a lot better. Cool. One last thing I want to do is to add a bit of a highlight to the grey beard. There is so much beard that it's a bit of a shame to not draw attention to it. And beards are really important to the look of a dwarf miniature anyway, so you want to make sure that these areas are kind of celebrated. So get a nice fine brush and just draw these little lines. You can dry brush this, I suppose, but I think dry brushing has a very sort of clean and technical way of bringing out details. Yes, it's accurate, but sometimes you don't want accuracy. Sometimes you want a stylized kind of look. And I always find that brushing on hair like this has its own way of giving it a special kind of character. So you apply the highlights where you expect that kind of reflective glint. Just like, well, okay, long story short, treat the hair like it was non-metallic metal, because then you have something that looks like it's glossy and reflective, just like real hair would be, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. And it's particularly effective when the color is very, very dark, such as is in this case, gray. So at best, it looks like it's reflective and has movement and life. At worst, it just looks like this dwarf is graying. And in my opinion, both of those are perfect for representing a dwarf from a Dwarf Giants team. Nothing wrong with a bit of experience. Nothing wrong with that experience translating to a few more grey hairs on what is essentially still a very sturdy warrior indeed. And a little bit of Nuln Oil to bring it all together to make sure that the highlights aren't running away with the surface detail. And yes, the last thing I wanted to do was add a bit of Goregrunta Fur for that belt, because I think you will find that it will pull the whole color scheme together. Just this tiny amount of a warm tone, warm reddish tone on a model that looks extremely cold, like so. And I always like this part of the process, because sometimes it's these little touches that really bring the model to life, like so. And his little section of exposed belt at the back, like this. And the last thing, last thing, sorry, many last things, a bit of flesh highlight, because anytime you get to highlight the flesh on the dwarf or draw attention to the flesh of a dwarf, dwarves generally have so little flesh showing that you kind of want to take any opportunity to celebrate it and to bring it out, to really triumphantly sort of dangle it to the viewer as part of the color scheme, like so. Because you rarely see dwarf skin on such heavily armored models, but it adds a lot of personality to remind everyone that there is a living creature somewhere under all of this armor and hair. And that looks really good when you apply it to things like his nose and so on. Okay, cool. So that's our dwarf giant complete. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed following me through on this process and this walk down memory lane a little. I think he looks great, and I'm sure he's ready to go wreck some elves there. Elves and Skaven, those are the tastiest. Oh, and maybe goblins. Crunch! Alright, cool. Cheers, guys. I hope you've enjoyed watching me paint this model as much as I enjoyed painting it myself. Take care, have a good one. Love you all. Like, comment, subscribe if you're into that sort of thing. If not, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers, bye-bye.